The brief series of interviews you're about to see come from Alex Newman, the author of the new book, Indoctrinating Our Children to Death. Newman's an investigative journalist and argues that public schools are not failing, but they're actually doing precisely what their founders intended them to do, which is to deliberately dumb down America's youth. The information you're about to see Newman share has been widely concealed from the public, despite being highly provable and obvious in original source documentation. Stay tuned.
Now, I think you really have to start at the beginning. There's a really powerful myth that just refuses to die, and every generation talks about this. Something has gone wrong. The schools aren't what they used to be when I was a child, and they're getting more and more woke. They're getting less and less focused on academics, and all of that is true, right? It gets worse with every passing generation. But if you go back to the beginning, you understand the mindset, the beliefs, and the goals of the people who actually created this system. All of it makes perfect sense. And so what I tell people is, look, the system is not broken. You just have to understand what was the purpose of the system. And thankfully, Josh, this isn't something we have to speculate about. The people who dreamed up this system, the architects of this system, the people who put it all into place were relatively open about their views. John Dewey, who's almost universally considered the founding father of America's public education system, this is a guy who was an aficionado of the Soviet Union. And we have the public record of this. He wrote articles about how wonderful he thought the Soviet system was. You go back a little further, you have a Horace Mann, who actually really was, I would say, the pioneer in terms of getting the government really involved in education in America. He took his cues from Prussia, which, again, was a dictatorship. They created the first ever education system of the state, by the state, and for the state. You go back a little earlier than that, the guy who first proposed the idea that the government ought to educate children, this was in the early 1800s. His name was Robert Owen. Very obscure today, but he was very prominent at the time. And this is a guy who was a full-blown communist. Now, it was before Karl Marx, so this wasn't, a huge movement, but he believed that we should dismantle the family. He wanted to get the children away from their parents so they could be educated to be good, collectivists. He wanted to get rid of private property. And to his credit, he believed so fervently in these ideas, he actually set up a commune to prove how great it would be. Totally failed. And when it failed, he didn't say, wow, maybe communism doesn't work. He said, I know the problem. It's because the government didn't educate these children to be what would later be called, the new Soviet man, right? A collectivist who does everything for the good of the people, so-called. So that's the background in a nutshell there that people need to know.
I want to interrupt this short film for a brief moment to tell you 3 different ways you can get Alex's book, Indoctrinating Our Children to Death. If you're concerned or interested about anything you just heard, you need to get this book. You can go to libertysentinel.org/save children. From there, you can buy it as a paperback, or you can go to Amazon and search Indoctrinating Our Children to Death and buy a Kindle ebook or a paperback from Amazon. And the third way you can get the book is you can go to libertysentinel.substack.com, become a paid subscriber to our Substack mailing list at any level, and we will send you a free ebook copy for free as a thank you. Let's get back to the program.
And so that was the genesis of that. We also know from a whistleblower, a man named Orestes Brownson. Fascinating story. So this man was very much involved with the Owenites, as they were called, this kind of early socialist movement. And he eventually became a Catholic, and he repented of his involvement with this movement. And so he blew the whistle on what they were doing. And he said that Robert Owen set up a secret society, was the term he used, modeled on the Carbonari of Europe, which was a nasty, ruthless group of individuals. And their 2 surface-level objectives were to shift public opinion in favor of at least allowing the government's camel's nose under the tent to kind of get started in education. And then they also wanted to get men elected to legislatures who would support the idea that the government should play some role in education. And he said, Orestes Brownson revealed in his expose of this, he said the ultimate objective was to get rid of Christianity. Those are his exact words. And he said, we weren't going to come out and tell everybody that we were going to get rid of Christianity. The plan was to first get a system of state schools and then national schools where we would exclude everything that couldn't be verified by the census. And, we wouldn't openly mock the clergy, but we would bring them into contempt wherever we could. And I think people need to understand how radical this was. When Alexis de Tocqueville came to America from France in the 1830s, he explained what a marvelous country this was, and he explained that virtually all education that wasn't directly under the control of parents was in the hands of the Protestant clergy. That was for the massive Catholic migration. And so there was no real government education at that time. Well, the system takes root in Prussia. Horace Mann brings it back to Massachusetts, publicly says he wants to get the Bible out. And, people are like, what? How could you have education without the Bible? That's like an oxymoron. It's ludicrous. So that idea died, but the quackery came rushing in. And then John Dewey picks up the baton. So after he finishes in Massachusetts, he travels the country. He preaches at all the state legislatures the good news of salvation by government education. Again, totally flawed view of human nature, rejected the Bible. He kind of got in with the Unitarians. They started off with the heresy of denying the Trinity, and then pretty soon they're into full-blown communism. Amazing. So he sets up the system in Massachusetts, travels the country, and by the early 1900s, almost every state had government schools, had compulsory attendance laws. Now, it wasn't like today where you're going to hand over your kids for 9 months out of the year, for 5 days a week, for 8 hours a day. I mean, it wasn't quite that extreme. They still had the Bible there because parents wouldn't tolerate anything other than that. And then John Dewey steps in. So John Dewey was another communist. He took his cues from the Soviet Union rather than Prussia. And he was very open about his love for the Soviet Union. He wrote a whole bunch of articles about how great it was and how they were instilling a collectivistic mindset in the minds of the children. And that's what he wanted for America. Now, he differed a little bit with the revolutionary Marxists in that he didn't think armed revolution and violence was the way to achieve utopia. He thought a gradual approach would be more useful. But he outlined this crazy plan in 1898 to dumb down the population. It's in an essay he wrote called The Primary Education Fetish, where he said, we have to do this gradually. If we force it unduly, there's going to be a violent reaction, is what he said. And he was right. There would have been a violent reaction. So he teams up then with the Rockefeller, and I'm trying to condense 200 years of history here into a very short.
No, it's great. Keep going.
Well, I appreciate it, Curtis. So he teams up with the Rockefellers, and this to people is really counterintuitive. Wait, you're saying a communist teamed up with the ultimate super capitalist to create this system? Yes, that's what I'm saying. Now, they had different beliefs, of course. Rockefeller wanted to make a huge amount of money. He had so much money, and he was getting attacked in the press. He thought, well, we'll give some away, and hopefully, people will write good things about us in the newspaper. And so they teamed up, they started off with an experimental school at the University of Chicago under John Dewey's leadership. And the Rockefellers gave him $3.1 million, which at the time was a huge, huge sum of money. And interesting, they graduated a bunch of kids who could not read, who could not write, who could not do math properly, who could not tell right from wrong. And John Dewey and the Rockefellers both thought, this will be perfect. So they set out to kind of nationalize this. Dewey ended up moving over to Columbia. They imported the evildoers who you know all too well from the Frankfurt School. A lot of them actually were laundered through Columbia University with the help of John Dewey and the Rockefellers. And they basically injected this poison through the teachers' colleges of the country and then through the textbooks, so that by basically the period after World War II, Dewey's ideas had taken firm root in public schools across the country. You had basically a dramatic shift in the worldview that was being taught to the teachers and then eventually to the children. He was so popular, he was made the honorary life president of the National Education Association. And I'll say one more thing about Dewey, because I think this is really critical for Christians to understand. He was a religious man, but not in the sense that any of us might recognize. He actually described himself as a religious humanist. And he and 30-something of his buddies, mostly from academia, got together and they wrote what they called the Humanist Manifesto. They really saw themselves as the creators of this new enlightened religion. And for some perspective, the very first tenet of this new religion, and people can read this document, it's publicly available, it says, we religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created, which you can compare and contrast with the Word of God, which says in the beginning, God created. And you see right there, you have a huge clash. Now, as you keep reading through Dewey's manifesto, you'll find it's basically communism. We got to get rid of the profit motive. We have to reorganize the means of production. We have to have collective ownership. And ultimately, the core of this religion is that because there is no real God, that makes us all God. And so we can determine then what is right and what is wrong. We can determine the best way to organize society. Forget the Bible, that's old-fashioned stuff. And it's not a new religion. It's actually a direct descendant of the same lie that Satan gave in the garden, right? Ye shall be as gods, etc. And for the folks out there who are listening, who are not religious, who are maybe not Bible-believing Christians, I want you to think about the implications of this, even beyond eternity and your soul. Our founding fathers said it was a self-evident truth that we were all created equally, and that God gave us rights, and the government existed to protect those rights. Well, what happens if you embrace John Dewey's religion? Well, you have no rights because there is no God. And so this religion gradually made its way through the schools, to the point where the Supreme Court in the early 1960s actually kicked the Bible and prayer out of schools under the guise of the First Amendment. And in the words of Justice Potter Stewart, who wrote the dissent, they actually established the religion of secularism, which John Dewey would have recognized as humanism. And of course, that was the plan all along. One of the co-signers of this manifesto, C.F. Potter, wrote a book, Humanism, A New Religion, where he explained that we were going to use the public schools to spread this new religion. And what's your Sunday school going to do with some of the kids 1 hour a week against 5 days of humanistic teachings? So you wonder, how did America turn against God? How did we end up leaving our heritage behind? Well, that's the answer. A false religion from the pit of hell has now been taught to our children for multiple generations, supported by our tax dollars, and now we see the fruit all around us, the suicides, the shootings, etc. The history is just so critical for people to understand, Curtis. This is an issue that's near and dear to my heart. I always tell people, if you can homeschool, it'll be one of the best decisions you ever make in your life. It's the gold standard. I recognize not everybody can or wants to homeschool, and so there are other options that I think are good. But homeschooling really is an incredible joy. And you're right, it's not government school at home. People have to get rid of that idea. Right. The last thing in the world you would want to do is government school at home. Why hurt your children in that way, right? Homeschooling, good homeschooling takes maybe a few hours in a day. I mean, you're not spending 6, 7, 8 hours a day. You don't need to. And still, your children will be light years ahead of the victims of the government schools. There are some good private schools out there, but I think it's really important to put out a major warning here. A lot of the private schools are worse than the government schools in very serious ways. And you're going to pay $50,000, $100,000 a year for the privilege of having your children turned into woke lunatics that hate you. So you got to do your due diligence. Catholic schools, half of them have now adopted Common Core. Half of all the dioceses in the United States have adopted Common Core for their Catholic schools. Why in the world would they do that? And why would a parent pay money to have the same dumbed down education in a Catholic school that you're getting in a government school? So if you're going to send your children to a private school, do your due diligence. There's a lot of questions that you need to ask, starting with basics. What does the school believe? What is your philosophy of education? Why do you do education? How do you teach reading there? What are your core values? What kind of materials? They're your children, right? You've got to seriously do your due diligence and make sure that this is an acceptable institution with acceptable people to delegate that responsibility to. There's no do-overs as parents, right? And we all want to do our best, but if you mess it up, you don't get to try again. So really spend some time thinking about this, folks. I do believe that we need to rethink the whole thing. And so what I do at the end of the book, and in a very long afterward, is I go back and look at the type of education that existed in America before the government camel nose got under the tent. And it's light years apart, and it worked so much better. So there are lots of good options, but I would urge every parent out there, even grandparents, anything you have to sacrifice to get your children out of the public schools, it will be a worthwhile sacrifice. And I say only half kidding. I would live in a cardboard box before I would send my children to public school. So parents, please think about this, pray about it, and protect your children.
Let's put the book back on screen real quick for TV viewers. Indoctrinating Our Children to Death. Government Schools, War on Faith, Family, and Freedom, and How to Stop It.
Indoctrinating Our Children to Death. Government Schools, War on Faith, Family, and Freedom, and How to Stop It.
Indoctrinating Our Children to Death.
Indoctrinating Our Children to Death is the name of the book. Indoctrinating Our Children to Death, Government Schools, War on Faith, Family, and Freedom, and How to Stop It.
He's written a terrific new book entitled Indoctrinating Our Children to Death,